Okay, we're live. Dr. Desai, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first seminar series of the term, of the year. I'm Manali Desai, the head of department, and I'm really very excited to welcome our guest speakers today to what is obviously a momentous day, likely to be whichever way it goes. The election in the US with global consequences, and we're all waiting nervously for the results, and we'll all have our own various, I don't know, comfort blankets and all sorts that we might need at the end of the day. I'm very pleased to also say that this event is also being live streamed for the first time. So going forward, we are very happy to have our events live streamed to increase the global reach of the talks that we're doing, the work we're doing in our department, and to sort of showcase our commitment to a kind of public sociology. And so I'm very pleased to see all of you here, and I would like to just hand over now to Ali Megji, who is in our department, lecturer in our department, and organizes the seminar series.
Hi, everyone. So as Manali said, today is a very big day. Something's going on in the States, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, and many of you might know something about. And it just so happens that today we're also welcoming two people who have recently written a book, Reactionary Democracy, how the far right became, how the racism and the populist far right became mainstream, which may help us to actually understand some of the stuff that's led to this moment in the States to begin with. So we're joined by Dr. Aaron Winter from UEL, who is a senior lecturer, and Dr. Aurelian Mondon, who is a senior lecturer from Bath University. Between the two of them, they have written about a series of topics, including Islamophobia, how extreme speech becomes mainstreamed and the boundaries between the extreme and the mainstream, Trump, Brexit, and the construction of the white working class to suit elite aims, the construction of hate and racism in online spaces, the mainstreaming of far-right discourse in left-wing news outlets, and finally, this book. So without any delay, should we go straight to your talk? And what we'll do then is we'll have time for a Q&A afterwards. The way the questions will work is if you just either raise your hand or pop them into the chat on Zoom, we'll try and get through as many as we can. I understand that lots of you will also be watching this on YouTube. So if you do want to kind of have a conversation about what's going on in the talk, please do kind of use YouTube to have the conversation, but try not to have too much of a conversation on Zoom. Otherwise, I will probably lose a lot of your questions. And just before we go through to Aaron and Aurelian, I just wanted to say thanks to Joe for helping us be able to do the seminar series online, and also for that really nice introduction with the music that was pretty catchy. I really enjoyed that. So I'll pass over to now Aaron and Aurelian. Oh no, you're muted.
Not a good start. Apologies. Hello, and thank you to everyone at Cambridge Sociology for the invitation and everyone for attending. Today, as we know, we're witnessing and experiencing, some more than others, a range of developments that we would like to speak to. First and foremost, probably on many minds, is the US presidential election today, with Trump ramping up the far-right rhetoric, fears of far-right mobilization and violence, the liberal centrist establishment candidate Biden being represented as the only hope against an illiberal racist Trump, the police killings of Black men and women, as well as protests, counter-protests, and crackdowns in the US, UK, and globally, the defense of statues and memorials of racists and slave traders, as well as continuing racist police violence and wider practices, a series of recent horrible terrorist attacks in various countries, and the Islamophobic rhetoric and attacks that followed the murder of Samuel Paty in France, the mainstreaming of illiberal eugenics discourses, and mobilization of the far right and exacerbation of racial inequalities by COVID-19 and various lockdowns. The ongoing reactionary culture wars and conspiracy theories, including attacks here in the US on critical race theory, and not unconnected to this, the emergence of a public discussion about not only the far right, but systemic racism and the need to address it. This after a long period of post-race celebrations and denialism, which it should debunk, but reactionaries are increasingly using it and other tropes to deny the reality of racism, asserting that it's just bad apples, that Black Lives Matter and anti-racists are making race the issue, or are the racists, that both sides are just as bad as each other, that all lives matter, blue lives matter, and even white lives matter. It is these issues and how we got here that our book looks to, and this presentation is going to speak to, although I'm not sure about making predictions about the election. Next slide. So Reactionary Democracy, the book and the presentation, look at four main issues areas underpinning this. Racism in the 21st century, what we call liberal and illiberal articulations, and the need to see beyond overt and the far right to understand systemic, structural, institutional racism and see the role of history in it, not merely as something to mark progress or paradoxically memorialize. 2, the mainstreaming of the far right today. 3, the populist hype and the deployment of democracy and the people for reactionary ends. And finally, Trump and the people. Now, just to clarify, we use the term extreme right for those movements and activists who express so-called illiberal articulations of racism and engage in violence or the threat of violence, whether verbal or physical. We use far right to describe movements and parties that espouse a racist ideology, but do so in a more indirect, coded, and often covert manner, notably by focusing on culture or occupying the space between liberalism and illiberal racism, between the extreme and the mainstream, a concept we shall return to. Next slide. So for racism in the 21st century, liberal and illiberal articulations, it is something we developed originally in our work on articulations of Islamophobia in ethnic and racial studies, and are indebted to the work of Jasbir Puar, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, Victor Ray, and others. And what follows is I'm going to sort of try to outline what these concepts are and how they may be useful. So next slide. Illiberal racism, or what we call illiberal racism, is often related to the popular definition of what people call real racism, as opposed to systemic racism. A false distinction, we would argue. It is often historical. It refers to forms of racism and sort of manifestations of racism that have been defeated, or may serve as a remnant of traditional racism, which it is argued by many who construct and use what we call illiberal racism as a concept. Racism ended in Europe with World War II and the victory of the liberal democratic order, America in the 1960s with civil rights, and South Africa later. We only keep the monuments and memorials to this, while terming what they may represent as dead, defeated, or extreme today. Examples of what would be called illiberal racism would be slavery and colonialism, Jim Crow segregation, biological or race science, fascism, genocide, racist violence, travel bans and deportations, and the contemporary extreme or far right, which are often represented as a remnant out of time and out of place in liberal, let's call them non-racist societies. Liberal racism, on the other hand, are contemporary forms of racism that distinguish themselves by basically not being illiberal or not being real racism. In that sense, illiberal racism is a functional concept to legitimize liberal democracy and the forms of racism which underpin and fester within it. It treats liberalism as the antidote or bulwark against racism, denying that racism within liberalism, as well as the lack of action on structural inequalities and continuity of less overt forms of systemic encoded racism. It uses the threat of the far right or illiberal racism to push moderate politicians and policies, including structurally racist ones, or maintain the status quo, such as Hillary's statement made earlier about the idea that if centrists, moderates, and the left don't get on top of the immigration issue, they will see the far right gaining more. And often it's time the far right or the extreme right are used as a sort of a threat to justify and push more moderate racist and xenophobic policies. You can also see this in Biden ads of hashtag Trump terrorism and associating him with Charlottesville and Dylan Roof. Yet, interestingly, when the left and liberals do this, they often don't even link someone like Trump to his own racist policies on immigration and bordering, because these might not be seen as unacceptable to swing and centrist voters, which is often the function of liberal racism and the construction of the illiberal. You can also see liberal racism in post-race colorblind and progress narratives, that racism and the far right were defeated with civil rights, then Obama's election. And in a sense, it keeps on coming back, and the goalposts keep on changing. Liberal racism is individualized, seeing racists as bad apples or aberrations, perhaps being radicalized, perhaps having sort of vulnerabilities that may lead to it, but not being a normal aspect of society. It often operates through liberal tropes, LGBTQ plus rights, women's rights, and free speech, often weaponized against Muslims and Islam. Now, just to be clear, liberal racism is a form of racism we're analyzing, and it itself often constructs its illiberal other. Next slide. Moving on to the, I guess today, with the election 2020, where Joe Biden, and this is an attempt to sort of unpack a little bit what's going on in relation to the constructed contrast between liberal and illiberal racism. Joe Biden is represented as a left liberal bulwark against racism and extremism, which are conflated. He even said that Charlottesville and Trump's response led to his candidacy, as opposed to Democratic calculations on the potential of Sanders and the left, both within American society and in the election, and Biden's electability and alleged appeal to the white working class. And we'll come back to that issue. Now, the idea of Biden being a left liberal bulwark against racism and extremism is supported by representations of Trump as far right regarding Charlottesville, and his call for the Proud Boys to stand down and stand by in the first debate. In addition to which is the fear of a no peaceful transition should Biden win. And FBI, Department of Homeland Security warnings about a terrorist threat around the election, as well as increased extreme right threat since 2016. Now, this construction also allows for and pushes support from liberal racists, as well as conservatives. So liberal racists such as Bill Maher, conservatives such as Michael Steele, and moderate GOP Republicans, state security and military officials. And there's become this thing where liberals say the idea that Trump is so extreme that military officials, state security sort of functionaries, and sort of conservatives, as well as liberals who have a track record of racism, are on board. And in a way, this constructs Trump as so extreme, so illiberal, that it justifies people who are on the right and often espouse racism or engage in racist practices, that even they're against him, which often opens the door to sort of like a more liberal candidate, a more centrist candidate, and a candidate who is willing to appease certain forms of authoritarianism and racism. It ignores the illiberalism and state racism of Biden and Clinton before him. In the push to oppose Trump's racism and get an electable centrist candidate, Biden's record on systemic racism gets less attention, except ironically from Trump, who calls him a racist and a socialist. Significant if you consider the impact of the 1994 crime bill that partly informs the history underlying Black Lives Matter's critique of systemic racism and implicates centrists like Biden and Clinton. This limits the horizon of critique a political critique, political analysis, but also anti-racism as both an analysis and a form of resistance. It is also worth noting that the FBI and Department of Homeland Security also warned about the left and anti-racists regarding election violence, having already cracked down on them far more than the far right. Next slide. So I've already pointed a bit to the blurry boundaries between liberal and illiberal racism. There are also other ways in which the boundaries of this constructed distinction or contrast are blurred. The liberal platforming and debating racists and the far right under the auspices of free speech. Defending examples of and monuments to illiberal racism and attacking opposition to it, attacking Black Lives Matter, attacking critical race theory, attacking the 1619 Project. Representing the far right and anti-racism as equivalent, or the latter, anti-racism, as racist and extremist, Black Lives Matter and Antifa, which may also unleash an illiberal response from the state, elected officials, and the police, and its supporters on the far right, vigilantes and counter-protesters, what are called counter-protesters. There's also liberals with shared commitments with the far right and mainstreaming to making America great again, monuments and history. Next slide. Mainstreaming of the far right. Now, it's not just that the far right in the mainstream as allies or interlopers, but their ideas, even when they are themselves rejected because they are too extreme. The concept of mainstreaming can be defined as a process where actors, ideas, and or narratives move from a marginal position on the political spectrum or public sphere to more central and or popular ones, such that they have an impact on the political discourse. Concerned about the far right, next slide. Concern about the far right has often been about influencing the mainstream. That the far right can somehow penetrate or damage our mainstream liberal sensibilities and societies. The mainstreaming of the far right is not new. This was also a concern in the 1990s and 2000s, but it goes further than this. The mainstream's meaning and position is constructed, contingent, and fluid, as is the concept of the far or extreme right. Since we posit the mainstream as such, it is crucial to stress that this process has no normative aspects and does not necessarily entail a moderation of the mainstream position. Manifestations of the mainstream and mainstreaming process can thus only be made sense of in a precise time and space and within coordinates of a particular political moment. The mainstream is not necessarily good or a bulwark against racism in the far right. This would fly in the face of progress narratives, of even those post-race progress narratives, as the mainstream would have historically had to have been racist too. Progress is not unidirectional or inevitable. There's backlash, resistance, and very much even just see what has happened on the back of or in response to post-racial narratives. Far-right parties and movements also move both ways. Referring back to the post-race narrative, it is worth remembering that prior to civil rights in America, racism, including state racism, and the far right were mainstream and the law and defended the law. In the nativist second era, when the Klan supported the Johnson-Reed Act, and civil rights in the third era, it was only after FBI and House Un-American activities actions against the Klan in the 1960s that they were separated from the mainstream and came to be the liberal image of racism, conflated with illiberalism or extremism. The far right, which has undergone mainstreaming now, had been on the fringes or in the wilderness, rejecting the mainstream in government and preparing for race war for much of the 70s to the 90s. But racism continued in the mainstream through earlier Nixon's Southern strategy, Reagan's war on drugs and welfare, Clinton's welfare and criminal justice reform, and both Bush's law and order rhetoric, as well as ongoing racial inequalities, which did not go away even when the Klan did. In other places, parties and movements underwent a discursive reconstruction, rejecting the more overt, illiberal, and fascist aspects and elements of the far right, or extreme right, trying to appeal to and gain access to the mainstream, often through more liberal and pseudo-populist appeals, rhetoric, and discourses. This occurred in France with the Front National and in the UK with UKIP. And just to share a quote from Nigel Farage, I destroyed the British National Party. We had a far right-wing party in this country who genuinely were anti-Jew and anti-Black and all those things. And I came along and said to their voters, if you're holding your nose and voting for this party as a protest, don't come and vote for me. I'm not against anybody. I just want us to start putting British people first, and I almost single-handedly destroyed the far right in British politics. It's not a coincidence that he left out Muslims and immigrants from the list of sort of racisms. There's also party politics and social movements and discourse can move together, but they do not have to, nor at the same time. Mainstreaming is not unidirectional from one source or site to another either. Now, the relationship between the elite, public opinion, and the people, which we'll discuss, and which can often be deployed or claimed to justify racist policies or politics, this is what the people want, is premised on uneven power relations. And next slide. Elite legitimizers, the liberals, reactionaries, and the media. We see often liberal reactionary legitimizers as playing a significant role here in this mainstreaming process. Politicians and advisors, Trump, Bannon, Miller, policy, links between policymakers and politicians and the far right, and tweeting each other. Liberal and conservative culture warriors, including the so-called intellectual dark web, which is now sort of dissipated somewhat. Sam Harris, Dave Rubin, sort of reformed, they call themselves reformed left-wingers or liberals. Barry Weiss, Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Brett and Eric Weinstein, Bill Maher, making the rounds on each other's platforms. See also here, Brendan O'Neill, Toby Young, James Dennypole. To emphasize the liberal issue, and we mean centrist, not left-wing, as opposed to racism as a liberal value, but a structural reality and problem. Bill Maher, who we keep coming back to as a sort of liberal racist and liberal enabler, attacked liberals for their lack of opposition to Islam. To quote, to count yourself as a liberal, you have to stand up for liberal principles, free speech, separation of church and state, freedom to practice any religion or no religion without the threat of violence, respect for minorities, including homosexuals, equality for women. He also appeared on MSNBC Morning Joe in 2019 to oppose the left, claiming Democrat left wing, Bernie Sanders, was a cancer, destroying the party, warning the left is scarier and crazier than Trump, to quote, and nominating a leftist as its presidential candidate would spell disaster for the next president. He then constructs, more recently, Biden as a bulwark against the racism and the extremism of Trump. So the center has moved quite further right. His opposition to the liberal Trump being the card also to defend against accusations of being a reactionary and a racist. There's also academics and writers who legitimize, amplify, and hype the far right in its support and its supporting narratives, such as the white working class left behind, as if the political establishment must take racists and the far right seriously. In addition to the intellectual dark web, there's Goodwin and Eatwell, David Goodhart and Eric Kaufman, and J.D. Vance, who recently came out as a nationalist concerned with replacement fertility, but has a Netflix film based on his hillbilly elegy coming out. Speaking of the mainstream, media, also platforming, amplifying, and legitimizing the far right, and supporting narratives, not just Fox and InfoWars, but MSNBC, CNN, BBC, Guardian, Harper's, and the New York Times. Reactionary platforms such as Spiked, Quillette, Breitbart, Rebel Media, and social media, normalization of racism and misogyny, red pilling and decentralization of reactionary discourses, and trolling of activists. On multiple platforms, Twitter to and YouTube, Reddit to Gab, Parler, and more. Now, there are also liberal and right-wing narratives, oftentimes espoused by some of the figures that I mentioned and platforms I mentioned earlier, that we refer to, including those that mobilize reactionaries and normalize reactionary politics about so-called social justice warriors and wokeness, cultural Marxism, critical race theory, and however odd ways it's represented. Free speech under threat, cancel culture, and the alleged bravery and courage of racists to speak out on multiple platforms, despite cancel culture. The white working class populist insurgency and will of the people, to which we'll now turn to Aurelian.
Okay, so we will be now talking about populism, and more populism. So what we argue in the book is that not only is the basis of a lot of our mainstream politics racist today, but it also has no ground in terms of democracy and democratic support, and that much of a kind of legitimization that has been created to support the claims that we need to talk more about the white working class, we need to talk more about white people, some ideas are cancelled or censored, is in fact built on very little. And so what we're interested in really in our book and in our research is discourse and the way these ideas come about and are legitimized. And we argue in the book and in various bits of research that the term populism has been misused widely to replace other ideas, and that's what I'll talk about first, and then I'll move on to talk about the white working class more precisely before concluding. So you can see some headlines here from 2016 after the election of Donald Trump, so 4 years ago, almost to the day. You can see the New York Times here, Trump's victory and the rise of white populism. Why is populism winning on the American right? So that was before the election, July 2, 2016 in The Atlantic. Foreign affairs, populism on the march. Why the West is in trouble? Trump's populism is only the beginning. Here comes the robots. So yeah, it's going quite far in terms of populism here and linking populism to lots of different things. It's not just the media, the mainstream media, including the more liberal media that of course has hyped populism, but it's also academics. And for example, here a study by Inglehart and Pippa Norris, Trump, Brexit and the rise of populism, economic have-nots and cultural backlash. In fact, what you can see in some of the research that we have done since with Katie Brown, that populism within academia has skyrocketed from 310 articles or items in Web of Science between 1970 and 79 to 1,498 between 2000 and 2009. To more than 6,480 from 2010 to 2019, and it's unlikely to go down. You will tell me, but what is the problem with populism? It could be a concept that is very useful to explain the current moment. And to be honest, it is. It is a concept that we have both used in the past, and it's a concept that we remain convinced has some use, but it's a concept that has also been massively misused, particularly in our public discourse. The four key issues that we feel are to do with populism is the first one is that it euphemizes. Instead of talking about the far right, instead of talking about racism or even fascism at times, we talk about populism. We talk about the populist right. We talk about white populists as opposed to talking about white fascists, supremacists, racists, and so on. Second problem is that it amplifies and it links these movements to the people. By calling the Front National, UKIP, or Donald Trump populists, we link them to the people as if the alternatives were not supported by the people, were not democratic in a way. So we're lending parties which have, in fact, as I will show with Trump very soon, which have very little support across the population, or at least very limited support across the population. It links them and lends them democratic legitimacy through the very word populism. Third, it denies the power of agenda setting from the elite. And instead of, it puts issues on the public agenda and sets the tone in public discourse. And yet the media elite, the political elite, the academic elite to some extent blames that on the people. If there is a rise of Trump, if there is a rise of Marine Le Pen, if there is a rise of UKIP and Nigel Farage, it is what the people want. It is what they want to talk about, and it is what they want in terms of policy and politics. And so all of these, we argue, contributes to the populist, to what we've called the populist hype, and has facilitated the mainstreaming of the far right, of racism and white supremacy, as if it was a demand from the people, as opposed to something that is fed by elite discourse. So what I want to move on now is to kind of challenge the idea that Trump was a white working class populist revolt, which is something that was plastered all over the news after his election. And it's a narrative that has kept on building. And it's a narrative that we have seen also in the UK, that we have seen also in France, which are the three countries that we're studying, but we've seen it also in many other countries since. The idea that if there is a rise in reaction, if there is a rise in the far right, it comes from the working class and mostly the white working class. To give you another quote from Nigel Farage, it seems that we're quoting him a lot today. In October 2016, so just before the last US election and very soon after the EU referendum in the UK, he wrote in The Telegraph, and I quote, "The similarities between the different sides in this election are very like our own recent battle. As the rich get richer and big companies dominate the global economy, voters all across the West are being left behind. The blue-collar workers in the valleys of South Wales, angry with Chinese steel dumping, voted Brexit in their droves. In the American Rust Belt, traditional manufacturing industries have declined, and it is to these people that Trump speaks very effectively." I mean, it is quite an incredible statement here from this guy and his mate in their golden elevator, the fact that they became representative of the working class, even though they shared very little with the working class and had very little understanding very clearly of what a working class life was. In fact, it is quite condescending to actually argue that these people would appeal to the working class in their droves. And it's also totally buying into their narrative, as you could see from that quote from Nigel Farage. But it wasn't just Farage and Trump who argued that they did embody the working class and the white working class. This was, in fact, brought up and lapped up by a lot of the media and political analysis since 2016 and before. And you could see it on the left-wing media, on the right-wing media, and across the board. You can see here, for example, the Washington Post, how Trump won the revenge of working class whites. And so what we want to do and what we do in the book is challenge this kind of ideas, such as the New York Times, for example, calling it the revolt of the masses, something that again has been legitimized by various academics such as J.D. Vance, Ali Hochschild, Strangers in Their Own Land, and many others ever since. So what we're interested in here and in the book and in our research in many ways, as I said before, is how narratives are constructed. And therefore what we focus on when we look at data and electoral data is data that is not just easily accessible, but also easy to interpret, things that any journalist could go to and understand in many ways. And usually what we use is the exact data that journalists use to make sense of the world, to make sense of our politics, and to make sense of democratic results. So this is the source for this data is the New York Times and Edison Research. There's a lot more in our book if you want, and in an article that we wrote. So please feel free to contact us if you want to know more about this. But I'll take you through some of the interesting kind of figures and data that we realized, and I think it might make sense of what will be happening tomorrow as well in the analysis, whatever the result is in a way, and how we need to be more critical in our approach to elections. The first thing that we want to say, of course, is that Trump was elected with about 25% of the registered vote, or 26% of the registered vote in 2016, which means that 3 out of 4 Americans who are registered to vote did not vote for Trump in 2016. Of course, that doesn't take into account all the American citizens who are not registered to vote, who have been deregistered, who have been pushed out of the registers, plus all the migrants, plus all the people who are below age and in various other categories of the population where they can't vote. So already the idea that Trump is the voice of the people is problematic. Of course, the other thing that we need to take into account when we think about voting and non-voting is the fact that usually the lower you are in terms of sociodemographics, on the scales of sociodemographics, the more likely you are not to vote, which means that the idea that Trump was brought to the White House by poor people, whether white or not, is already problematic in as much as the poorer you are, the less likely you are to vote. But let's look at the figures in more detail. So what we tried to do here is to look not just at the difference between 2016 and 2012, between Clinton and Obama and Trump and Romney, but try to go back 4 elections when George W. Bush was running against Kerry. If you look first at the vote according to income, you can see that if you look at the 2 lowest scales in terms of income that we have access to with this research, you can still see that Hillary Clinton does a lot better with the people who earn under $30,000 and the people who earn between $30,000 and $50,000 than Trump does. Of course, Trump does fairly well, and he does better than Romney, for example, and McCain in the kind of lowest setting, but he does, in fact, not quite as well as George W. Bush. And you can see that George W. Bush did very well in the second bracket in particular. What you can see, in fact, here, before I move on to this, what you can see, in fact, here is that Hillary Clinton does a lot worse than Barack Obama, both in 2008 and 2012. In fact, 10 percentage points lower for the under 30,000. And 6 percentage points lower than in 2012 with a 30 to 50,000. What you can see as well, if you go to the left, the size of a category in 2016 is that these two categories are fairly small compared to the 50 to 100,000 and 100,000 to 20,000, which is where Donald Trump does best. And if you look at the wealthiest parts of the population, so 50,000 and above, this is where Donald Trump wins the elections in terms of votes. Of course, this is not just necessarily in terms of vote. As you all know, Hillary Clinton had actually more votes than Donald Trump, but this is not how the US system works. But here, to create the narratives of whether Trump is the man of the people and the man of the working class, you can already see that just according to income, this is quite simply not the case. If you look now in terms of education, we are often told that it's the people who are less educated who tend to kind of fall for conspiracy theories, who tend to be more xenophobic, who tend to be more racist. And again, here you can see that while Trump did indeed appeal more to people without high school diplomas or with just a high school diploma, you can see that, in fact, the difference is not that great compared to Bush and Kerry. So, in fact, again, you can see that Trump is not necessarily something entirely new, and his electorate is very similar to the one that George W. Bush had in 2004. What you can see as well is that many people who have some education and a level of education voted for Trump. And you can see that with the people with some college or associate degree, people with college graduate, with still 45% voted for Trump, and people with postgraduate studies, 37% of them still voted for Trump. And even though it's fewer than for Romney, McCain, and Bush, it is still quite significant. Finally, the last level that I want us to look at is according to race, because I think this is one of the important one. And here Trump's performance with white voters is very strong. But again, it does not appear to be significantly different from previous Republican candidates. And look, for example, at Clinton and Trump, 37-58. If you look at Kerry and Bush, 41-58. There is no denying, however, that Trump managed to appeal more to less educated white men than his predecessors. While Bush and Romney appealed to 61% of white men without a college degree electorate, McCain 58, Trump appealed to 67% of that category. But it is also worth noting that Trump won the majority of white professional males with a college education and over 40% of white professional females with a college education, pointing further to race or whiteness of a class as a key factor, something which is traditional in the Republican vote. This is backed by other research, such as Public Religion Research Institute survey that showed that Trump's appeal, could be better explained by a fear of cultural displacement than real or feared economic displacement. Interestingly, responses to supplementary questions in various exit polls have suggested that beyond the traditional Republican electorate or middle class and upper class conservatives, Trump managed to appeal to a similar electorate that we find in the resurgence of the far right in Europe. This electorate feels insecure about its future, even though it remains in a relatively privileged position, and it is more interested about issues such as immigration and terrorism than it is about the economy. Therefore, what we argue is that rather than a radical shift of the working class towards Trump, what we have witnessed is the development of a typical far-right electorate by European standards. While this is certainly a concerning development, the size of this particular electorate is marginal and would not have been sufficient for Trump to win if the Democrats had managed to retain their share of the vote. A more significant finding is that the largest share of Trump's electorate does not appear to differ from traditional Republican voters, and particularly from Bush's. This means that Trump is more the confirmation of a trend which has seen a radicalization of the Republican electorate, with racism being increasingly normalized in American politics and the resurgence of the far right rather than a break with politics as usual. But there's more to this. And we argue that there are a number of problems with misusing class and its implication to explain the return and the resurgence of reaction and the resurgence of the far right, whether it is the Front National, Trump, UKIP, and various other parties. The first is by misusing class, we construct and racialize the working class as white, and we pit an elusive white working class against minorities and immigrants who are denied working class status despite the immigrant history and diversity of the working class in a competition for scarce, deregulated, and casualized employment and ever-dwindling resources. So this idea that the working class is essentially white and racist completely denies the reality of a working class on the ground. Second problem is that it constructs the white working class as privileging their racial interests above class ones and as being racist. And this is very important because historically, as I'm sure many of you know, the working class has been seen as a category that brings up social progress in many ways. And here, now, the working class is more often than not seen as something that kind of leads us towards racial regression almost, and towards the kind of more illiberal forms of racism. If our societies, our liberal societies, are not working well, it is because of a working class, even though quite often, if liberal societies ended up working well, it was because of a pressure of a working class to demand more rights, to demand more equality in our society. Third problem is that it normalizes and mainstreams racism in both discourse and practice by claiming it is a popular demand, first legitimizing hate crimes and the rise in far-right activity. By saying that this is what the people want, it forces the mainstream politicians, media, and academics to accept this and to push this narrative to some extent. Quite often you will hear politicians say, you know, we don't want to do this, but that's what the people want and we have to abide by this. As if, of course, politicians didn't have any role in this. The same with the media as well. You see the media talking more and more about issues of immigration, issues of refugees. And when I say issues, like they talk about it in a negative fashion, you could see that in the Brexit referendum and some amazing work that has been done at King's College on this, the coverage of Brexit. And what it does is like it says that's what the people want, as if editors of journals and didn't have any power to choose what was on their front page and what was discussed and how it was discussed, problems of agenda setting, as I discussed earlier. Finally, in addition to not addressing the inequality faced by white working class people, it exacerbates the inequality and vulnerability faced by racialized and migrant working class peoples, and actually serves establishment political and economic interests, conquer and divide. So, to conclude, and hopefully we are still on time, what we argue is we must be against reactionary democracy, and to do so, we need courage and accountability. And we have a few kind of points that we feel are important to achieve this, or to at least go some way towards achieving this. The first one is to stop hyping the far right. We need to be far more critical in our approach to the far right, particularly when we have access to shaping public discourse, whether as politicians, media, or academics. We need to stop exaggerating, amplifying, platforming the far right when this can be avoided and when this is not useful. We need to remember that racism evolves and adapts. It is not exhausted by its illiberal articulations. We need to give up the idea that we live in post-racial societies, and we need to reconcile ourselves with the fact that racism, like any other ideology, evolves and adapts, that racism is not just the Nazis, the Ku Klux Klan, that racism is also within our structures and systems. We need to remember that racism is not only in the other. That racism is in our structures, in our systems, and that racism can be in the liberal as well. We need to remember that the far right is not the alternative, or at least not the only and inevitable alternative. Too often in public discourse, we tend to pit the liberals against the far right. We need to go beyond that. There are other alternatives that we need to explore if we actually want to create better, less racist, more equal societies. Finally, we need to broaden political horizons. We need to return to more emancipatory forms of democracies, away from simply counting voices, numbers, and towards things that actually include everyone and anyone. So really, I mean, we don't want, as Aaron said right at the beginning of his talk, we don't want to make any predictions for tomorrow. And of course, we do hope that Trump will be defeated tomorrow and that Biden will win. But this will come with its own sets of challenges. Anti-racist movements will likely find more support against the illiberal far right and against illiberal far right politics. But systemic racist practices, which were mainstream before Trump, are likely to return or remain to the liberal realm without being addressed, let alone dismantled. Therefore, what we need to make sure of is, of course, celebrate the defeat of Trump, but make sure that we remember that this is not the end and everything is not forgotten or forgiven. And I'll end on this. Thank you.
That's a nice background. So thanks so much for that talk. It was really, really interesting. And I think that it's really important what you concluded with, in the sense of that we're doing sociology, right? So we're not talking about particular individuals, but we're talking about longer societal trends. And that regardless of what happens today and tomorrow and in the coming weeks, that we recognize that problems, social problems, don't just disappear when particular individuals disappear or remain. So that's something for us all to be thinking about. So now we're going to open it up to a Q&A. We've got around, well, we've got quite a long time actually. What do you say, Joe? Around 30 minutes, 40 minutes?
Yeah, I think half an hour is reasonable.
Okay. So what you can do is you can either raise your hand and I'll come to you, or you can pop your question in the chat. If I miss you out, if you have raised your hand, do pop it in the chat. It's not a deliberate exclusion. We've already got a couple of questions. Whilst you're all thinking of some, I just wanted to open the discussion to you two and ask, what is reactionary about reactionary democracy? What does that concept do?
Want to go first?
What we argue is really that, I mean, it's slightly for shock that we're using reactionary democracy in a way. What we argue is that democracy doesn't have to be progressive. I think we've come to the point that we see democracy, if you want, as an end goal. But there are many forms of democracies, and we tend to forget that. And of course, today, when we talk about democracy, we talk about a certain form of democracy. And what we try to show in the book with Aaron is that even though this is what we have come to accept as democracy in our common sense understanding of the term and politics nowadays, we argue that actually it's promoting reactionary politics in many ways. It's giving it's giving space to voices that are deeply reactionary, and it's giving a space to these voices that is unwarranted, that is actually not based on the support of the people, on the support of the demos, and on various other kind of definitions of democracies, which we think would be better fit for purpose to actually create the societies that we believe would be not only just truly democratic, but also just and egalitarian in a much kind of more positive sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think on one hand, we're looking at democracy being sort of weaponized for reactionary interests, ideas, and ends. But at the same time, if you go back to what we were discussing about the post-race narratives, the way in which democracy can be used to both justify reactionary politics, justify or conceal inequalities. So the idea that democracy has trumped authoritarianism or totalitarianism is often sort of a pat on the back democratic systems give to themselves, contrasted with something which is so extreme and unacceptable and illiberal that it can't but look better in the eyes of those who buy into that economy. And so, in a sense, the democracy conceals or justifies racial inequality and can be used to perpetuate and reinforce racism. And I think for us, that's also where these two things come together in relation to liberal and illiberal racism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. So we've got a couple of questions here, well, 3 questions now. So the first one comes from Valentina, who's actually just submitted a PhD, which is investigating far-right politics, and that's what she works on. She's got a great paper out in Sociology Compass, which kind of looks at different approaches to explaining far-right success across Europe. She asks, aside from the white working class narrative, how do you position your findings in relation to the cultural backlash thesis, which argues against any class-based explanations?
I can go if you want, Aaron.
Yeah, sure. We'll go back and forth.
Yeah. First, congratulations on submitting your PhD. And well, I mean, this is quite interesting, right? And we do talk about it quite a lot in the book, and this is something that we're also interested in exploring more. I think the way we talk about it, and again, I mean, we could talk about it forever, really. So I'll try and summarize it. Is that some people have used the cultural backlash, I think, in an ideological manner. And I'm not saying that everyone who has used it this way, but some people have kind of used this then to push their own kind of reactionary agendas. I think quite often what is forgotten when we talk about the cultural backlash, or when we talk about the working class in general and working class support for the far right, whether again it's real or not, whether it's exaggerated or not, is we tend to forget about how our knowledge of politics is mediated, and our knowledge and understanding of politics is mediated. And we tend to kind of put this kind of cultural backlash on the shoulders of the people, however you understand the people, right? Whether it's a working class, whether it's democracy or the demos or anything like that. And we tend to kind of think of these categories, the people, as if it was created in a vacuum, as if it had its own idea. And I say it's on purpose because we tend to see the people, we tend to kind of anthropomorphize it almost. We tend to see the people as this kind of unified and unitary composition, you know, almost. And what we forget is that people know politics, and they know politics, particularly at the national and supranational level, through mediation. We all do, even I do as a so-called political scientist, right? I don't know all the ins and outs of political system. I don't know all the ins and outs of every political issues. I have to trust some mediated aspect to make decisions about things that are much bigger than my kind of small life in a way, to some extent. And so what do I trust? Well, I trust lots of different things, right? I could trust, in the past, people trusted like religious institutions, less so nowadays, their family, friends, social media. But of course, still to today, despite social media and everything, it is the traditional mainstream media that we trust. If you look at the UK, it's the BBC still that has the most reach in terms of telling people about the politics they know, and it's the same in other countries as well. And so what we try to argue in the book in many ways is that we need to turn things around. It's not necessarily the people that focus on these cultural aspects. It's also what they're given, if you want. And so, you know, of course, we don't want to fall into conspiracy theories that the media tells you what to think. It doesn't. But the media can tell you what to think about. And I think one thing that's fascinating about this, there's been lots of studies that have been done on this, but one that's fascinating is the one I was talking about Brexit. That's done by Gordon Ramsay and another colleague about the Brexit referendum. And it shows quite clearly the role that the media played, hyping the question of immigration, not always negatively, but mostly negatively, but hyping it as opposed to other issues. And we try to show that as well through the Eurobarometer in our book as well, to show that, yes, people might feel that they culturally, that there's a problem with kind of like a cultural backlash, if you want. But I think we need to explore where that comes from and who creates that, you know, the chicken or the egg. Is it the people who want it, or is it a more kind of elite-driven process that, you know, diverts our attention away from actually class issues?
Yeah, just to follow up, first let's say congratulations. And there's a lot to unpack there. But I would say, I guess the way in which the different theses function, I guess is where I'd want to start. I mean, if you look at the Left Behind thesis, it can do two things at the same time. It can actually make reactionary politics look like they're coming from a disenfranchised material reality. So there's an underpinning material basis for people feeling aggrieved, ignored, disenfranchised. But what then happens with the Left Behind thesis is the theorists of it consistently project cultural values and cultural insecurities and identity issues onto it. At the same time, attacking anti-racists and for having sort of woke identity politics and making everything about sort of identity, which is somehow postmodern and constructed as opposed to based on a material reality. Now, what ends up happening with the Left Behind thesis is that now that you've said that white people are left behind on a material basis, it's not just about rich white men worried about their privilege or worried about and defending the nation, but projecting these kind of almost sort of less global, more provincial concerns on the white working class. So I think, in fact, it's patronizing to the working class, but it makes class it makes whiteness about victimization on a material basis. And then what ends up happening is, and I mean, there was a lot of debate about this. Again, it's too much to unpack, but at a certain point, I think a lot of the left behind analysis goes, well, yeah, it's also cultural. But it's still seen as being about the working class's concerns, as opposed to, again, all these elites, these often white male elites, who are constantly now talking about white civilization and defending Churchill and defending this and defending that, which shows you that actually what they're doing is they're manifesting a cultural insecurity that is worried about the loss of their privilege and the loss of empire, a loss of a whole host of things, which are not necessarily linked to people's everyday lives on council estates in a context of Tory austerity. So in a sense, I've always found that there's also the idea that culture is also, class reified or whatnot, but there's a series of functional and tactical moves that are going on with not just the relationship between class and culture, but also the opposition between them. Like somehow the cultural insecurities are fake and the class ones are real. And I think the class ones can often be a proxy for the cultural ones. And I don't think it's good enough to say that I'm culturally insecure, so that justifies cultural authoritarianism, racism, cultural chauvinism, etc.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think it's really interesting to remember that just as you were both describing the categories of the mainstream and the far right as being shifting, the same applies for our understanding of culture and classes and so on, right? These are also not objective things, but things which are constantly being produced through particular material and symbolic social processes, right? Philip, I noticed you had your hand up, but you've taken it away. Did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Hi, yeah. I was just putting it into the chat box because I wasn't sure that function worked. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, all good.
Okay. So I'll just read out the chat rather than pressing enter. So how do you account for the fact, and first of all, thank you for that very interesting presentation and congrats, Valentina, good job. How do you account for the fact that most of those people we could define as working class don't vote, and therefore their preferences are not captured in a great many liberal democracies? In fact, they're rarely surveyed by polling stations. So for example, in the UK, low working class turnout is attributed to a perception that their vote doesn't matter because whoever wins in parliament, it's full of self-serving managers and accountants, as described by the late David Graeber. And that's actually not a wrong analysis of the makeup of the British House of Commons. There can also be principled reasons for boycotting the ballot. For example, in Israel, where Palestinian citizens of the country who make up the working class don't vote in very large numbers because they do not wish to lend legitimacy to a racist system.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and that's something that I've found fascinating for years, to be honest, and that we worked on quite a bit with Aaron, and we discussed quite a lot in the book and in other publications. I think the way abstention is dealt with in our democracies says a lot about the way we understand democracy. The idea that voting is no longer a right that you can decide not to take up, but now it's a duty almost. And just look at the way non-voters are talked about. Even the threats right now that you can see on Twitter about if you don't vote, you're on the side of fascists. And it's like, yeah, okay, but as we've discussed, and as Aaron I think showed quite well in the first part of the talk, the alternatives, Trump is terrible, and we hope that Trump loses, but Biden is not exempt of any criticism, and is not really the only alternative we should have on a ballot box. And I think this is something that we see across liberal democracies. What's fascinating about abstention and non-voters is that, as you said, and as we discussed in the talk, is that it's not spread evenly across categories. The poorer you are, the more likely you are not to vote, but also ethnic minorities tend to vote far less as well in many countries. And so it's quite often the people who don't feel represented. And as you said, for very good reasons. What's interesting is that then their categories tend to be hijacked by the far right, or, well, not ethnic minorities, obviously, but the working class. What's fascinating about it is that very little research has been done on this. There was some amazing research that was done in France quite a few years ago now. And I remember when I got to the UK about 8 years ago now, I wanted to kind of see whether anything had been done here. And I remember asking around to a few colleagues who were specialists in British politics, like, have you heard anything similar to what had been done in France a few years prior to that? And they sent a few messages to various kind of colleagues, political scientists. And I remember one of them responding, someone very prominent, responding like, why would we bother? It's so complicated. Because it's hard to talk to people who abstain. And yes, it's hard, but should that stop us from researching it? Probably not. What we argue, in a way, is not necessarily, we don't want to imbue non-voters with a kind of normative, positive aspect. We don't think that the people who don't vote necessarily want the kind of democracy that we would like, or the kind of society that we would like. And if they were forced to vote, they might vote for Trump, or they might vote for the far right. What we want to do is kind of make us think about the way we interpret election results as democratic and as in a non-critical way, if you want. Just think of Brexit, for example, right? The 50 to 48%. If you take abstention into account, which is around 27% of British people who had the right to vote in the Brexit referendum didn't vote. If you include that, that would mean that, you know, you could have headlines, instead of having headlines saying 52% voted for Brexit, you would have headlines that would say 37% voted for Brexit, 33% for Remain, and 27% abstained. Brexit won. You know, it would be the same. Brexit would have won, right? But it wouldn't be the 52-48. It wouldn't be the voice of a majority. It wouldn't have led to the discussions we've had since. If Trump, it had been told very quickly, very early on, that Trump had been elected with 25% of the vote, he would still have been elected, because that's a very silly system, to be honest. But he still would have been elected, but at least he would not have been called the voice of the people, the voice of the working class, and all of these kind of things. So I think it's important the way we talk about these things. It doesn't mean that we need to, we certainly shouldn't force people to vote. I think compulsory voting is a massive mistake. But I think we need to talk about abstention, and we need to talk about why people don't vote. And there's some very valid reasons. There's some really bad reasons, like being lazy, not caring, and whatever. And then again, that could be explained with some good reasons. But there's some very valid reasons not to vote today as well, I think. And I think we need to talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to add to that. I mean, I think I'm watching online, I think Aurelian pointed this, the way in which the vote is being used in discourses around the election. And I'm finding it fascinating that you have people saying you have to vote to save democracy, or, you know, stop racism. And we know that, I mean, we've talked about this, there's a lot of conditions and qualifications you'd have to put on that, as well as suspend disbelief. But the other issue is that I'm seeing sort of Biden supporters simultaneously say, we have to vote because others cannot. At the same time, we hope that Trump voters don't make it to the polls. And what's interesting about that is the way they represent Trump voters is in such a classed manner that they already may be disenfranchised, not because of their whiteness. And so there's an interesting use of the democratic imperative. And look, I mean, I always vote, but I'm quite allergic to the idea that if you live in a certain society, you have an obligation to vote. You know, you have, because again, there are many reasons to resist, oppose, or there is real disenfranchisement. But I think the sort of the liberal, the privileged liberalism of saying, I'm voting because they can't, and I hope they don't make it, I think really exposes the construction. I'll leave it there.
Mm-hmm. We've kind of opened the floodgates. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you a series of questions from the chat, and then I'm going to go to Manali and Tobias, both who have their hands raised. So don't worry, I've seen that you have your hands raised. To begin with, we have a couple of kind of empirical questions. So firstly from Sarah Franklin, and she's asking you, essentially about the cultural content of right-wing populism and right-wing populist narratives, and how it ties together white Christian family values with issues like gun control, abortion, and immigration. Another empirical question by Ilaria is how we can think about some of the themes you were talking about in your presentation, to think about far-right responses to COVID and lockdown and kind of the fascist governments or fascist groups' resistance to government measures in those regards. And then we have a methodological question from Katie. And it's essentially asking, what responsibilities do you think sociologists and other social scientists have when you're researching issues like the far right?
I can start this one if you want.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was sort of like taking notes about the first one, so I missed part of the second one, so I'm gonna have to come back to you. But in terms of the content, again, I don't think we would call it populist. And in fact, if you look at that chain of signifiers and political interest, ironically, I think Ernesto Laclau does a good job of articulating them as forms of populism. But I think I don't think it is. I think it is actually traditional sort of post-civil rights Republican alliances and interests. So the fact that you can have Reagan did it very well. Nixon, with the moral majority, found a way to bring religion in, or to mobilize and embolden religious interest in elites with gun ownership, with the white working class of the industrial or post-industrial heartlands of the 80s. I think it is multiple things. I think it's looking at social groups and the interest or institutions that bind those social groups, that can be brought together and consolidated around a particular sort of not just ideological or cultural movement, but a capitalist one, effectively. The charitable status of religions and the big society narratives that came out later on, the way in which individualism can be mobilized around guns, and rugged individualism around guns, around anti-welfarism. There's a good argument to be made for the way in which self-sufficiency fits into this, and the way in which the church can be helped to mobilize against, ironically, welfare and social safety net. So I don't think it's necessarily about populism or that it's a new thing. I think it's a long-standing tradition. The fact that I guess in some ways it fits back into the other one is that you can bring together material, cultural, and ideological kind of interests in a way that for some people they think it's about, the family. For others, they think it's about, taxation. For others, they think it's about, defending the family or defending against the government. The way guns can be articulated. So they can pivot on the same issue or interest. I think the other thing is that what's interesting is how that actually got done under Trump. And I think that's the big question that's always coming up is, how do you get the former moral majority, the right-wing Christian evangelicals, organizing around Trump? And this is not because of morality. This is because he serves other interests. And these are interests that are not going to necessarily vote for Democrats. So it's a way of organizing. I don't know if you want me to touch on some of the other ones, or Aurelian, you want to go for?
Well, you can look at the second one and I can start answering it because I think you've covered the first one. So Ilaria, your question, I think it's a big one as well, and something that we haven't necessarily worked on directly on COVID, but I think, and I assume that Aaron will agree, but if you don't, say it, I think I think it's fascinating the way the far right has responded to COVID, because in many countries where there's been the biggest response against lockdowns, against these kind of measures, there's been countries where actually their people are in power. You know, think of the UK, for example. And so I think to me that speaks of contrarianism, the fact that a lot of the leaders of these movements are just contrarians and they're just never happy because it's grift at the end of the day. You know, that's what they're making money on, and so they'll always find ways to complain, whoever is in power. And we've seen that with, you know, you can see that with Farage, for example. You can see that with all the people who are in the free speech union and all these kind of people. Even though they have all their people in power, they have all the platforms they want, they're still complaining no matter what. I think it's also down to conspiracy theories, which are quite prevalent on the far right, and COVID lends itself perfectly to all the conspiracy theories, and, you know, whether it's anti-vaxxers, whether it's the control of the government and all these kind of things. So I think it brings the kind of more illiberal extreme right groups. So I think that's where it kind of brought them together. And of course, there's the amplification of, you know, Donald Trump, for example, the amplification of that you can see in the UK in a lot of mainstream media or mainstream politicians doubting the science and all of these kind of things. So I think, you know, it was a perfect storm in a way where COVID hit a time where there's kind of a lot of kind of far right discourse that's emboldened and mainstreamed. Do you want to add something to the second one, or shall we move to the third one?
I just want to say I agree, but to link it back to the first one, I saw an interesting phenomenon is the way in which the far right and libertarians in America are both anti-lockdown, deny the the risk of COVID, but are also, particularly the legitimators like Ben Shapiro and all these, they're still hawking their like bricks of gold and their oxygen masks and their food supplies for 10 years for the apocalypse, which somehow serves both far-right survivalists and Christian evangelicals who may have a sort of millenarian or apocalyptic kind of mindset. So the fact of the matter is they're hawking, they're both contrarian, and they're doing what serves their multiple seemingly contradictory audiences and interests, but it all makes money as well, and it all serves reactionary purposes.
And with regard to the third question, Katie, I think we have a lot of responsibility as sociologists, political scientists, or academics generally, and I think a lot of us have shied away from it, and I think that's a big issue. And a lot of us have, you know, taken this as a grift as well, and I've made a lot of money, you know, building on reaction, facilitating reactions, playing into reactionary movements because there's some juicy contracts to get, and that's really sad. I think we've got to stop pretending that there is such a thing as that social sciences are the same as hard sciences, and we can be objective scientists removed from the topics of our studies. I think, you know, if we want to seek impartiality, we have to acknowledge our positionality, where we stand, what we stand for. And Aaron and I have made very clear where we stand on as we wrote this book. We are, or we hope to be anti-racist. We are anti-racists, hopefully, and we wrote it based on that. We are not standing between racists and anti-racists, you know, giving a platform to both of them. We think that there are things that are right and wrong. And I think as sociologists and political scientists, we have to explore that quite forcefully, because we have a role to play in shaping public discourse.
Yeah, I mean, we've written also a piece on sort of a sort of ethics and politics of researching the far right. I mean, I agree. I think almost
I'm
obviously,
glad you do.
but yeah, it's like every once in a while. Now, but I also think that it's important to make this clear, what you stand for and what you do. I mean, it's amazing how often far-right politics or far-right academics, where am I? Total Freudian slip, sorry. Researchers of the far right don't seem to care about racism unless it's in far-right terms, and often provide a platform of amplification for them. And where there's an attempt to combat them, it tends to be in quite individualistic conservative terms of de-radicalizing the vulnerable or individuals, which serves to legitimize them. There's also seems to be in work on far right an allergy to the term racism. It both exceptionalizes racism, renders it extreme, and then treats it as an individual phenomenon. I mean, not unlike a lot of things that sociologists look at when they're studying racism, but or responses to racism. But I think the field really needs to be treated to a great deal of criticism, particularly at times when you have a lot of people seeking contracts, opportunities, and impact with conservative governments that are amplifying, legitimizing, normalizing, and mainstreaming often far-right ideas. And they don't seem to think that that's a contradiction in any way or undermines their fight against what they think is racism.
And that's then kind of like representative of what Du Bois was talking about all the way back in 1898, right? When he says that it's hard to remain cool, detached, and objective when people around you are being segregated and lynched, right? So yeah, as social scientists, we're working in a particular world. We're not separate to that world. We have almost run out of time. So what I'm going to do now is just go to Manali and to Tobias, who have both been wanting to ask a question. And then if anyone else has some more questions, if you just leave them on a YouTube, Aaron and Aurelian, you can feel free to just dip back to that live YouTube and answer anything going on. And also we can just use that YouTube chat to get the conversation continuing after this talk, because it's opened up so many areas of conversation. Manali, do you want to ask your question first?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I just wanted to ask you, since you mentioned Leclerc, what do you think might be the limits of a kind of discursive understanding of this emergence and, you know, hegemony of, or hegemonic project of the far right? And also, what are the enabling, at the same time, what are the enabling conditions of this kind of discursive coming together? So, because what I'm hearing is a very well-developed theory of all the elements that have come together, but what I'm not hearing is sort of what you think are the enabling conditions, and therefore what might be also the limits of a theory of the far right based upon this kind of discursive coming together. And I was just kind of thinking a little bit about sort of the liberal illiberal distinction around racism, and wondering, what do you make of Obama, you know, who one might say obviously represented, as far as one can see in the, you know, history of decades of American politics, a moment at which anti-racist, a more public anti-racist element of, you know, discursive elements were emerging, but they were at the same time underpinned by a kind of infrastructure of state power, the global reach, in which I'm just reading that example. By the end of it, his administration, they were dropping 3 bombs an hour, right? So, you know, what is the limit of, so I'm just thinking sort of more systematically about what might be the limits of this kind of an explanation. And also, it seems to me that you know, what you're describing in the US has a global resonance. And for example, I work on India, and I think a lot of the elements we're seeing in the US or even in UK and Europe are emerging under very different conditions with very different histories in a country as far away as India, right? So it seems to me that there's also a scalar issue here about thinking of the ways in which a kind of infrastructure of global networks, you know, whether they're military, whether they're financial, you know, the word neoliberalism didn't really emerge very much, but of course, you know, these have then the sort of these ideas have a kind of elective affinity with those sorts of transformations. I mean, I don't want to go on much more. I just wanted to hear a little bit from you, but I had, yeah, longer thoughts about it, but yeah.
Really interesting questions. And Tobias, do you want to ask your question, and then Aaron and Aurelian, you can take them all?
Yes, so thanks for the talk. It was very fascinating, and I think brings up so many different issues. But I was wondering about because you talk about the intellectual dark web, so-called, but also how these types of discourses are mobilized. And I was thinking about the way that liberal ideals are used for illiberal purposes. And I will just mention, when you hear most of this, now you hear Trump talking about patriotic education and fighting against intersectionality or critical race theory, I think is what he focuses on. And of course, this is big on the intellectual dark web. But what was interesting is that we see right now very similar developments in France in what is in some, Piketty has said that the tax plan of Trump and Macron is actually very similar and so on. But Macron would be the sort of more establishment figure or Biden-esque figure, not a Trumpist in that sense. And yet, right now, there's a sort of imposition of Republican values in the academy. And when everybody's talking about free speech, it seems like in France at the moment, it's very difficult for different discourses to come through on the question of laïcité and what that actually means and what that actually, what that type of freedom of speech actually gives rights to. So I'm just wondering about the question of this imposition of things that are called free speech and so on in the US, in France. Why do we see it on both sides in that sense? Why do we see these similar tactics being used in what some would say are radically different politics?
Do you want me to start? Or
Yeah, sure.
You can catch the yeah, I mean, in terms of the conditions of this, I guess it depends. In one hand, we're looking at the convergence of discursive ideological forces on a terrain that has, in the past number of years, particularly if we take Britain, for example, you have 10 years of austerity in which there's a scapegoating of the poor, the disenfranchised, et cetera. In some ways, the racism becomes an exchange mechanism, like that there's a way of weaponizing this the disenfranchisement by the right to serve and perpetuate its interests. I think a lot of what we're talking about is historical convergence of certain narratives and discourses on top of particular historical developments. So the Obama situation, yes, in a sense, liberal racism that we're discussing has been largely constructed on top of Obama. Obama becomes the signifier that racism is over, but also that a liberal anti-racism for a moment is okay, but even that can be constructed as extreme in the minds of reactionaries. And I think the backlash started, I think part of what we argue is the backlash started because he's a Black president, but it also mobilized a notion of post-race that said, if racism is over, then the reverse can also be true. That actually, if all people are equal and we don't have to, white people no longer have to apologize for their racism, they can be victimized by racism on an equal playing field. And I think in a sense that the emergence of Obama allowed for both the emergence of and consolidation of a liberal racism, but also a backlash. And I think that's part of what we're talking about now. The fact that there was a global financial crisis also allows the right to mobilize not just resentment and reaction, but lay it on those most directly affected by austerity, deindustrialization in certain parts, and their long-term effects, but also these are the same reactionary forces that are calling for austerity, that are calling for deindustrialization. And so there's a material reality to it, but it gets manipulated and weaponized. I think the other thing with Obama that's important to note is that it wasn't just the bombs, but also the fact that Ferguson and Black Lives Matter emerged in this context. And what I'm finding fascinating looking at some of what we call the legitimizers, is they're constantly making an argument that Obama is the one who destroyed race relations. And they're doing so in a manner that suggests that they, for a second, bought into post-race. But of course, they only bought it in so they could quote Martin Luther King in the service of a colorblind racism that allow them to deny racism, argue that white people can be the victims of racism, and hate Obama. And you see the same thing in this election campaign with Trump talking about how he's the best president, he did the most for Black Americans, and that Biden is the racist because of a number of things, including the 1994 crime bill. But they're doing so in a way that is to affect often liberal and Black support for him, as opposed to gain it. And I think in a sense that this does pivot on particular historical conditions and developments, but it also pivots on certain narratives being accepted and being able to be utilized. And I think that's where we talk about the emergence of this, and the conditions for it are also the amplification and legitimization of particular narratives, like the left behind, the white working class claims, the cancel culture, the demand that you can no longer speak because there is an anti-racist dominant order. And so the fact that these narratives become so consolidated and so accepted, it doesn't matter if they're true or not. They become the conditions upon which activists and movements and interests can be mobilized. And I think that's part of what we're arguing. I'll leave it there so you can come in.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, just to add to what you just said as well on discourse, I think what we're really interested in as well is to kind of show the way the construction of kind of real top-down approaches to politics are in fact considered and turned into bottom-up kind of narratives. You know, the fact that, you know, if we have this backlash against Obama, even though Obama was far from perfect. I mean, you mentioned the bombings, you mentioned Ferguson. There was also the immigration laws, right? And the record numbers of immigrants being sent back. You know, the record is quite terrible. But then you have these bottom-up narratives that are created to support top-down processes and to support top-down privilege in many ways. And that's what we're interested in terms of discourse. To go to Tobias's question, I mean, this is exactly, you've defined what we call reactionary democracy better than we did at the beginning with Alice's questions in a way. It's the idea that you use liberal ideals to support illiberal aims in a way, and that there are fuzzy borders in between the two. And that's what we argue in the book in many ways, is that there's not just liberal racism on one side and illiberal racism on the other side, but fuzzy borders. And what we argue in one of the chapters of the book is that liberalism, in fact, has never really been a bulwark against illiberalism and illiberal racism and racism in particular. And that quite often, you know, if we've made progress, it wasn't because of liberalism itself, it was quite often against liberalism. But of course, we've kind of forgotten about this. And that's something that you see in France. And we have, so France is one of our 3 case studies in the book. We have France, the UK, and the US. And we talk a lot about laïcité and what's happening today with laïcité and, you know, with the latest attacks and the reaction to the latest attacks is very similar to what happened in 2015 after the Charlie Hebdo attacks. And it's similar to what happened in 2004 after the law against the hijab. And it's similar to what happened in 1989 after the first kind of hijab affairs as well. This idea that laïcité, which is a concept that can be positive, that can be negative, that can change depending on how it's talked about, is kind of reified in a way, and you can't be critical of laïcité. And I remember once when we launched, and it's quite incredible in France, the level that this has reached, the kind of acceptance of that kind of reactionary understanding of laïcité and république, which has to be almost Islamophobic. If you're not Islamophobic, you can be Republican in a way. When we launched the collection of essays called After Charlie Hebdo in France, we launched it with a number of French academics who were on the left, and they really took offense at our chapter with Aaron, where we called it the Reactionary Republic, I think. And they're like, how can you call the Republic reactionary? And we said, well, if we're calling it reactionary republic, it means that there could be a republic that's not reactionary, but the one we have today is reactionary, and we need to call it out, because the one we have today demands people to either be Islamophobic or to forcefully remove their hijabs or whatever garment they wear because of their religion, which of course is a particular religion that's targeted and things like that. But even these people who were on side politically had completely accepted the idea that you could not be critical of a republic and laïcité, even though the concept of laïcité, the way it is understood today by Macron and by the mainstream in France, is very different to the way it was understood 100 years ago when these people refer back to the law of 1905. It's very, very different. And so that's what we try to criticize in a way, is the kind of reifications of certain concepts that used to be positive or that might have been positive at one stage to defend particular privileges and to push forward reactionary politics.
Okay, thank you so much, Aaron and Aurelian. I think we're just coming up to 2 o'clock, where I imagine that lots of us may have to go off to stare into our computer screen for another few more hours, actually. So thank you so much for coming to talk to us.
Thank you.
And it was such a great presentation, and 45 minutes worth of questions just speaks to the fact that you really did open up really important conversations to be having across the social sciences and outside of academia much more broadly. Anyone still watching this on YouTube, please do feel free to continue the conversation in the chat there. And we'll have our next seminar in 2 weeks with Dr. Alia Rao from the LSE talking about how couples manage unemployment in different ways across gendered norms. So thank you so much once again, and look forward to seeing more of your work in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.